I'm really excited to welcome Ben Freyinger and Mohamed Sharif to our lunchtime lecture series here at UCLA AUD. They are both colleagues of mine, having taught with me here at UCLA for a really long time. It's not only an exciting opportunity for you to meet them as two more additional faculty. You met already Neil Dinari and Kati Barkarn this week, but also an opportunity for you to get an insight into their professional work. Both of them work extensively in residential building design and housing here in Los Angeles, and they're gonna show us an insight into their work. I will ask Hayden now to introduce them with their bio, and then we will start 20 minutes each and have hopefully a conversation at the end. So let me welcome Ben and Mohamed. Thanks so much for coming today. I'd like to welcome our first guest speaker, Claus Benjamin Freyinger, who is a co-principal and co-founder of the LADG. Ben is a guest lecturer at UCLA AUD. His design interests include the repurposing of architecture and architectural history for contemporary audiences, and building relationships between architecture and fine art practice. Prior to co-founding LADG, Ben held positions at Mones and Partner, architects in Munich, Germany, and Kohn, Pedersen, Fox Architects and Planners in New York. He holds a BA in art history from Boston College with a minor in fine arts from the Ludwig Maximilian's University in Munich, Germany. Benjamin received his MArch from UCLA in 2005. Prior to working in the field of architecture, he gained fine art curatorial experience working for the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, Italy. I'd like to welcome Ben.
Thank you, Hayden, for the nice introduction. It's been a bit since I've stood up here, actually, I think 3 years, pre-pandemic, but this place is very, very familiar to me. First, thank you, Yulia, for having me here, and again, Hayden, for the lovely reprise. But really, why am I here? So in addition to teaching here, I also graduated from AUD in 2005. And to give you a little snapshot of how long ago that was Greg Lynn was making teapots instead of sailboats. Neil was big in Japan. Tom Main was here still, yes. He won the Pritzker Prize. Jason Payne and Heather Roberge were styling hair. Servo was making dark spaces, and Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee were having us pin up. We were literally always pinning up. So ever since then, that is my business partner, Andrew Holder, and I have worked on projects ranging in scale from retail environments to exhibition design, even large landform installations for music festivals, all of which have one singular ambition, which is the production of concrete stuff. More specifically, the production of physical architecture, which has a specific capacity to shape and influence culture. We have two cultural projects in mind at the moment. The larger scale arts and cultural project, i.e. institutional work with LA organizations such as LACMA, and second, housing, which everyone is of course talking about here in Los Angeles. We have a housing crisis and shortage, which is for us the smaller scale cultural project and ultimately more identifiable with houses. So what are you looking at here? This is not a house. It's also not houses per se. It's neither. Kind of like Los Angeles, this image represents the mishmash, or represents a mishmash of things, a mishmash of productive stuff, which has the unique capacity to congeal as a whole. This also comprises our sensibility around housing. So what I'm showing here is Brooks Scarpa. It's called The Six here in Los Angeles. Maybe to sort of loosely paraphrase my colleague's work, and then I'm gonna move forward to also Michael Maltz's Star Apartments. So to loosely paraphrase my colleague's work here in Los Angeles, the larger scale, perhaps more corporate firms are on one side of the scale of projects with multi-unit, medium, and high-rise housing, whereas we sit at the other, the far end of that scale. We're asking what happened to houses? Specifically, not necessarily by just adding more houses or more housing to the mix, but by rethinking the social and functional logic of the house itself in the broader context of Los Angeles culture, and how perhaps the domestic space of that culture is rapidly changing around us. So Mohamed Sharif, who I'm fortunate enough to co-lecture with here today, also, I would argue, sits on our side of the spectrum, but I might argue with a kind of LA-centric scalar sensitivity. That is, Sharif Lynch claims a territory which comprises everything from low-rise to the impossible fit ADUs, LA's unique version of the urban infill project. I'm super excited to see what Mohamed is going to show, as there's a lot I know that they are working on, and very excited for the discussion that follows. So in that spirit, I'm going to look backwards very briefly before coming back to the right now. Here's what we did during lockdown. We were making maps. We were looking for patterns, groups of lots and areas with positive attributes for speculative development in Los Angeles. We have maps of vacant lots, maps of greater FAR, that's floor area ratio, buildable area in Los Angeles. We mapped elevation views. We mapped proximity to schools, infrastructure, and desirable community resources, utilities, etc. All with the ambition of finding and understanding patterns of urban growth in Los Angeles. We mapped land value over increased value over time. We mapped sales over increased turnover, and mapped density versus low densification over time. Maps, 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 and more maps. And our conclusion was that these lots aren't easily developable. And as such, all of these lots have been overlooked, skipped by early 70s and 80s sprawl, or there is a cultural impetus, a misalignment with preconceptions of LA living, that the lifestyle advertised in Sunset magazine of the 70s and 80s doesn't fit here any longer. So to test these site attributes against new possible forms of inhabitation, we built lots of models. We modeled archetypal case study houses. We modeled prototypical houses. We modeled our version of speculative LA neighborhoods and hillside areas, all to speculate about how new types of neighborhoods, which could result from development of individual lots and clusters, could emerge in Los Angeles. We're focusing on these misfits in the hopes of mining new territory for increased density and a new site for unconventional multifamily communal and cooperative living. So then flashing forward, what are we up to right now? Not coincidentally, our clients for 5 recent houses in Los Angeles are on these kinds of leftover misfit lots. They represent what I might call the new middle class. That is, those persons who in some way wish to retain some portion of the former American dream, which is to own one's own symbolic piece of nature and embrace the positive economics of ownership presented by 2 previous generations. Except the nature of ownership and form of familial relationship is shifting rapidly. Seen here is an image of R.M. Schindler and cohort living at the Kings Road house. I don't know the exact date, I believe sometime during the late 40s, early 50s. Mohamed will correct me later because he probably knows. Yeah, seems about right. And we use the kind of Schindler family cohort as a way to test our thesis. So we're asking, can our ideas translate from single families to larger groups of people? Can we go back to each project that we built previously and double its density? Could decisions be made for a single client to become the basis for speculation about how to live life as part of a multiple near to others? And can we imagine new ways to coexist? These misfit lots that we've been researching, the super narrow undersized infill lot of the flatlands of Rainer Banham Surfurbia, and a few which Banham missed, the steep formerly unbuildable hillside lot, the fringe canyon site, and finally the flag lot. These are the site of our investigation. So the project I'm going to highlight today is on one of these lots, a flag lot. And as I talk, I'm first going to show this project. We call it House 1 in Los Angeles. It was originally designed and constructed as a residence for 2 artists in the Mount Washington area of Los Angeles. So in other words, we have 2 clients who, despite their uniqueness, share certain traits. Each one of these 5 houses was designed for just one family. These families were all relatively young or perhaps mid-career. They had various definitions of the word family, but all of them looked at the project of designing their own home to render that definition in solid form. Coming of age in that era that glorified dense urban living and the myth of the creative class, these families nonetheless wanted something more like the suburban ideal of previous generations, a singular patch to call their own, a plot of grass, the symbolic kind of image of suburban living and the urban model, and each had a strict budget. They were therefore limited to building in specific parts of the city on particular kinds of lands, older neighborhoods plated out in the subdivision born of the early 1990s, distant from downtown or in difficult infill lots filled with irregular and substandard parcels on steep or strangely shaped lots. Usually these parcels already had small houses, so they all required a radical rethinking of an existing house or teardown, although the demolition was in each case constrained by the city's complex rules and encouraged new houses to fit the physical framework of the building that existed before. From the point of view of our 5 houses, the city of Los Angeles is like a sponge, shot with little holes and underutilized patches. The sponge, which is capable of absorbing a far greater density of people and building. The limit to this absorption is the new architecture, is that the new architecture always had to be about coexistence from the very beginning. It had to reckon with old neighborhoods on infill sites and with thin building codes that strongly imprint new work with old patterns of development. Put another way, new houses must learn to share as a condition of arriving on the scene. As densities increase and our sponge of a city continues to absorb, this imperative will translate from the world of design to that lifestyle. Neighbors will have to learn how to occupy mutually held territories and develop new habits for using them. This cooperation will not only be house to house, separated by yards and a fence in the usual conventional way. In the very near future, it will require more intricate forms of negotiation and contact as density shrinks yards and multiplies the number of families per parcel. In order to meet the new generation's continuing desire to live in something like the now old model of the single family home, all of these demands will paradoxically mean getting more dense while retaining the loose, free-ranging character of Los Angeles. It's imperative to share is not, this imperative to share is not confined to the world of neighborly relations. So as such, at a larger scale, the urban fabric will have to share resources and disaster resilience strategies in order to successfully coexist with the non-human world. In Los Angeles, there are no abstractions. So water is a vanishingly scarce and resource and must be collected in an ad hoc house-by-house system of catchment basins to irrigate domestic landscapes. Neighborhoods must share small-scale infrastructure to withstand disaster. Fires, earthquakes, mudslides, and floods cannot be resisted at the scale of individual houses, but can be managed if house to house, neighbor to neighbor, we share small things that happen to leak and spread across multiple properties. Drainage swales that double as yards, retaining systems that stabilize hillsides, swaths of fire-resistant plants. Long-term architectures will be those that already know how to share across all of these different registers. It's not so much an issue of social responsibility as it is already a Darwinian whittling away of individualisms that don't work. So we set ourselves the task of revisiting each of the 5 houses currently built as speculative projects. We are committed to sharing and coexistence at 3 scales. First, the density of each project will double, a single family's isolated compound will become two imbricated groups of people. Second, new houses will extend ideas about coexistence to the immediate neighboring properties. That is, we may not be able to redesign entire neighborhoods, nor do we think anyone should, but we can position yards, driveways, windows, and paths so they are less about isolation and more about carefully orchestrated contact. And third, each of the new houses incorporates a small-scale infrastructural element designed to be part of a larger neighborhood system for living in Southern California's beautiful but ecologically harsh conditions. That's all. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our second guest speaker, Mohamed Sharif. He is a partner in Sharif Lynch Architecture, an assistant adjunct professor in the UCLA AUD, serving on the faculty since 2011. He teaches in both the undergraduate and graduate programs. He is currently the director of the undergraduate program and was the director of the summer programs from 2017 to 2019. With 25 years of professional experience, Mohamed has completed numerous award-winning projects in many sectors. As an active critic, Mohamed's essays and reviews have appeared in a broad array of publications, including 30, 60, 90, ARC, Constructs, JAE, and Log. His most recent essay is the introduction to Soil's work in the Japanese journal A+U. He served on the editorial board of ARC, Architectural Research Quarterly, from 2006 to 2016, and was a longtime advisory board member of the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design, previously leading it as president from 2007 to 2009. Mohamed holds a Bachelor of Science in Architecture and a Master's of Science in Advanced Architectural Studies from the Scotland Sutherland School of Architecture in Scotland. He spent his third year of undergraduate study at the Illinois Institute of Technology as an exchange student. His master's design thesis earned the James B. Johnson Thesis Prize, and his undergraduate dissertation on Venturi and Scott Brown garnered a Reba Butterworth Heinemann Prize. And in 1993, the Reba retained the dissertation and into its permanent collection. So please welcome with me Mohamed Sharif.
Thank you, Caden, for the introduction. Lots of scary dates in there. Yulia, thank you so much for having us. Great to see recent graduates and alum teachers in this program. Morgan, my colleague also in the office, Stephen, Sune, anyone else there behind the mask? I can't see, but Charlie, current student. Benjamin, my dear friend, colleague. What a wonderful presentation. I can only hope to add something. So Yulia asked us to present about the idea of house and housing. And I thought, I would come here today and share 4 projects, 3 that are currently on site, 1 that's complete, and that each of these would illustrate an Angelino condition that we were dealing with, I think, a sense of the realpolitik that Ben beautifully put out there, issues of scarcity, density, I'd say the kind of the arithmetic of the city and how to deal with it, hopefully qualitatively. But before I do that, I'm going to actually take us out far away from the city with a residentially related project in the realms of what we say in the professional world, hospitality. Before that, I was just going through old images. This sort of end of the day, pre-pandemic. I'm usually the last to leave. And I just thought, well, at the time, what are we working on? Looking back on it now, well, it was houses and thinking about housing. And so, can I move this out of the way? Yes, there we go. That's easier for me. And before I go to the prologue, just some of the things that we've been thinking about recently. There was a recent competition that a lot of our colleagues here in Los Angeles and beyond entered. It was the low-rise competition. And basically the idea was for us to reimagine the residential world in Los Angeles when the single family residence is no longer the first increment, but rather 4 units, or maybe in our cases we argued 6. This project was Morgan was a prime mover on this project, and like Ben, we were thinking about what we call a communitarian fabric. That if we're going to divide up the sort of typical single family lot and add more units on it, while we applaud the idea of increased density, we also are not so invested in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that we could learn from the single family residence, that we could maybe look to new dimensions, tighter dimensions, leaner conditions to produce more joy in the ground of the city and between units, so to speak. And when we're dealing with setups like this, formats like this, inevitably we're also looking at the vernacular landscape, i.e. that which is not architecture, i.e. that which is not self-consciously designed, but sort of more a part of the fabric of need, as opposed to desire, which I would argue that architecture aspires to both. And what we were thinking about when we did this competition was an idea of practice as applied research. So we were looking at a very skinny infill building that we were working on as a prototype for this, and then we were in a feedback loop. Oops, how do I move forward? And then we sort of imagined what this would look like as a rollout beyond just the prototypical lot, what kind of a kind of confetti urbanism this might provoke. Oops. I can't work this, but how do I go backwards? There we go. We look at residential architecture very carefully. We look at the posture of buildings very carefully. And I think that we try to relieve ground, meaning space around buildings, very carefully. So models like this illustrate the attention that we give to all of the surfaces. And as Ben alluded to, these surfaces are having to do more and more work these days in terms of just obligations to the sun and energy and shade and you know, what we would call sensible environmental approaches. We look to create space through subtraction. We try to create qualities in what are otherwise quantity-driven conditions, essentially stacked plans. We try to work with the section to create more interest within what would otherwise be sort of a pancake, kind of a sort of generic setup. We are looking at larger housing projects, thinking about the stack and porosity, the space between the parts in the whole. And we are looking at edges and surfaces to do more than merely seal hermetically and kind of demarcate strongly between the world out there and the world in here. So as I said, we're going to be looking at 4 projects. The ones closer to the ocean, one that's was completed relatively recently, 3 that are on site. But I'm going to take us out to Desert Hot Springs to speak more globally about some of the qualities and the obsessions and how they are going to filter back to these projects in the city. I want to give a huge shout out to my practice partner, colleague, and friend, Todd Lynch, who was the lead on this project. And it's an interdisciplinary project with an interior design practice, with a landscape practice, and was granted a building permit just on the eve of the pandemic. And our practice saw it through construction. And you can imagine back in those days, mosques, having to pour concrete and in the desert, so many logistical issues. So I just want to tip my hat to my practice partner, and to say that for those of you entering architecture, and I know Ben, you face this every day, we don't just address our screens. We're also out there and trying to make sure that things are taken care of. So Desert Recharge is what we call it in the office, and it is essentially an expansion of the Two Bunch Palms Hotel, which is a pretty significant little oasis. Al Capone, apparently, the gangster, used to hide out there. And what's useful what I find useful in terms of introducing this project to the discussion about the domestic landscape is that in hospitality, as in hotels, when we leave our homes, if we're so privileged to do so, to enjoy ourselves elsewhere, I think that amplifies the idea of home, right? It's a home away from home. And so what does that mean for an architect who not only looks but sees? We pay attention to things that I'm about to discuss. Now, of interest here, we're borrowing Rainer Banham's classifications of the four ecologies and adding the fifth, which was a late obsession of his, deserta, the desert. So we're starting in the desert and going back through the plains of Id, back through Utopia. We're going to be in the foothills for a little, and then we're going to be in Surfarbia. This is the site a few years ago from Bing, obviously arid. There's an existing building. There are some existing recreational surfaces. Our practice was tasked with expanding the treatment facilities. And so what we did was essentially the 9 primitive huts, if you will, tilt up precast concrete. The task of these primitive huts was to, you see my cursor here, these guys running down in phase 1, then the next phase will happen here. That expands the landscape. This is an expansion of the playscape, if you will, is that these objects on the one hand, sort of the idealized Platonic primitive hut, sort of a simple prism prefabricated, is also a networked object, is also a thing that is tapping into underground hot and cold water sources. And so this reminds us that buildings are not islands unto themselves, but are umbilically linked to myriad things. And I think our task as architects, those of us who are invested in kind of making sure that what we put out in the world is as idea driven as a beautifully made model, is that we manage that material, we understand it and find ways to integrate it and decide whether or not we're going to express it or suppress it. What you'll see here is also simple things that we do that you'll see in the buildings, is we rely on symmetry and asymmetry, that there are ideas about holding a line, let's say, defining an edge, but also instead of thinking of it as a solid line, thinking of it as a dashed line or a dotted line. So thinking about porosity, thinking about connectivity, and how those things manifest in standalone buildings. This is a close-up plan. What is of interest here is threshold, is the space, or the porch, let's say, the space between the exterior and the interior, and then also a rhyming, a resonance with the trees as a colonnade. So how many layers are involved in defining an edge? That's something that we're interested in. Quick images of the construction, large panels, super simple, but as also our last summer colleague and recent graduate, Sine, helped us visualize and understand that these things are, they're not Donald Judd objects out in the desert. They're integrative. And just again to talk about threshold, to talk about edge, to talk about symmetry and asymmetry, simple moves, teasing out a section from a planar object. And I'll end there with this. This image always makes me think of the buildings as little rodents seeking shelter in the desert. So I'm going to start with a house right now that is in Beechwood Canyon. It's has it's a beautiful site. It's an existing building. How am I doing for time? Good. You're shrugging. I'll be really quick. All right. So house is down here. Hollywood sign is up there. You know, where more majestically rich to live than here if you're a cool bachelor who wants to do something in the city. So the house, as we inherited it, is a collection of rooms with one rear view and one front view, otherwise compartmentalized. So what we did is evacuate it, is open it up. So we were subtractive. And so if the house is this, as inherited, as you can see, the large patches of black here denote private areas, as well as sort of spatial obstacles. What we did was open it up, define the private bedroom wing as separate, and then open up the space, scoop out the surfaces subtractively to give this home the section it had but didn't know it did. And so some of the things that we find fascinating, I certainly find fascinating, is paying attention to the optics involved in space, the perceptual dimension of space, and the oscillation between, let's say, a painterly one-point perspective way of thinking about space, and then maybe a more cinematically active perspectival way of thinking about space that brings into play the idea of simultaneity, which, if we, it's a 100-year-old idea as inherited from Cubism in painting, but this idea of unfolding and unfurling. So field of view, depth of view, panning, tracking, and the diagonal are super important as kind of optical axes. So here's a few shots of it in construction, and we can see this is a foggy day, but that is the city, 270 degrees. Behind us is the kind of the garden and the Hollywood sign. But what I want you to pay attention to is these moments of viewing through intervening rooms. And I'll say, like, what I didn't say about the prologue is that we're obsessed with rooms and how to have both the idea of the open plan and the room at play. And so this sort of collapse of interior portal, the space in between, then the next interior portal, which is a window, that interplay we find to be super exciting and expansive, spatially dynamic. And then here's a further subtraction, is the conversation pit. Courtyard house. This is a house that, so if this house is at the top of the hill underneath the sign, this next house, we're closer to the ocean, the Courtyard house. It is here. It's an expansion and a complete remodel and addition to this single story corner house in Santa Monica with an attached garage. Demo drawing, what we built, what we had, right? So this figure ground sort of describes the object, right? So the plan, as you can see, for us is very important as a score. And what we did was define that room in the middle. And what we did in defining that room in the middle, is open up the garage as essentially a yoga room. So what you're seeing is, you're always seeing through, and you're seeing from the farthest reaches of the house diagonally as possible, and you're seeing through intervening rooms. The house is inherited, and then the second story addition, as well as this sort of inflation and expansion of a single story room into a great room that lofts from single story to the story up above. That's to give you a sense of the roof, what you see. This is it under construction. Here, what's enjoyable is the courtyard, as defined by these walls, these window walls, these door walls, becomes not just a void, but actually a center of gravity and a place with its own sort of weight, right? So air is weight. And so this is, again, looking towards the second level. And you see simple platonics at play, and loft sweeps from one surface to another to create some complexity geometrically to activate section. Here you always get the long view, and then you get sort of almost as if you have a lazy eye, and then perspective, the lateral world gets implicated. So through that skylight, that's us up there looking back down onto the courtyard, and there you have it. This is our house, and it is an addition. You can see the L here to an existing bungalow. This is the figure ground of the existing house before it was remodeled and added to. This is what we did. This is a sort of a public-private of what the old house used to be, essentially a series of rooms accessible off of the central vestibule, right, leading into different rooms with zero relationship to the landscape, which, by the way, is sort of a strange typical condition in LA, that there's, for a place that likes to think of itself as blurring inside and outside, not really. So what we did was open it up, and again, when thinking about plans and the look and positioning openings, it's about having both the open plan and the room and a sense of diagonal as well as one-point perspective axial visual relationships. This is it before, there it is after. This is what it is at a certain point before you add to it, point of no return, and then you see the L getting played out. The garage obviously then becomes an anchor point for the space in between, which is a social space, right? The space between the house and the garage then becomes defined as an outdoor room, and that's pleasurable. Is to give you a sense of porosity, that you're not just getting porosity in the vertical plane, but you're sorry, in the plane on which you stand, but also obliquely across volumes up, above, and around you, and the idea also of seeing through intervening rooms as a way to aerate and create visual porosity. This is a moment in between demo and what it is. And then I'm going to finish on Slender Slip-In, which is a project that Morgan worked on through CDs and permitting and Sine as well. And this is an accessory dwelling unit that is not in a single family residential fabric, which is sort of the typical, but in a multifamily where we have an existing duplex in the front, an existing bungalow in the back. There is a pool right there that I'm hovering, a really nice little oasis. And what was available here was a slender 13 feet by 57 feet that we could work in. And this is the project that was a sort of a prototype, a back and forth feedback loop with the low-rise competition that I showed you. So these are some of the drawings that Morgan put together for the boards for that. And again, we were thinking of long, skinny, and tiptoeing like an alley cat around the conditions you're on to not just kind of get by, but to create qualitative spaces in between and underneath. So if this is the site as inherited, this is a plan of the first floor where we have a relatively small footprint, and effectively the ADU is really planned as 2 units, where this is a studio apartment. And then if this is the figure ground as inherited, that's the figure ground of the roof plan. This is how close we get to the next building. This is actually 1 inch away from this building, which defines it as a detached ADU, not attached. And this is the figure ground of the ground, right? So sculpting chamfering, pointing. These are also things that we do to sort of put objects in a kind of relational tableau. This is a model of the conditions, and again, views through obliquely are very important, because especially in these narrow conditions, things can get pretty suffocating. I will say that the second story is almost 14-foot ceiling. You'll see that now. Again, these are quick shots from the production, the not representation files, but to illustrate how close we are. And these are drawings that Zuen Ki, who is also a recent alumna, put together, sort of the dollhouse to show you what's going on. We had to maintain parking for the existing in the back. This is the strange T shape that we were putting into play in the low-rise competition. And this is to show you the site. This is the base. That's the thing emerging. Classic kind of Venice condition of, it turns out some of the things that we're doing now are not alien to the environment, but we're more self-conscious about them, and we're teasing out qualities that rarely exist. So I would say this has obviously a lot of resonances with the vernacular of the dingbat, which probably you guys will talk about. And these are some recent construction shots. This is the second level, the main living level. This is almost 14-foot high ceiling, but again, this sense of situational awareness that there is something beyond, and not just doors, but openings, very important for us. Sorry, this is this one got stretched. Again, to just show you how, the close quarters in which we're working. This is the pool, that's the bungalow, and then that's from the neighbors. So in a way, it's a sort of proof of concept of the low-rise competition. If we start to take that fence down between these neighbors, and we're seeing through, etc. And this was the diagram that we did for the low-rise, is that if this world up here is the world of LA, where this is the house in the front and this faint light is a sign of life and the garage is in the back, we're imagining a ground plane that has much smaller pieces and much more opportunity for interaction in a kind of communitarian fabric, much in the way that Ben beautifully described. Thank you.